Welcome, listeners. You are about to hear a captivating and suspense-filled tale, written and narrated by me, Vincent Gray, exclusively for the Detective Chronicles channel. In this story, secrets long buried are uncovered, and a web of deception unravels as Sherlock Holmes steps into a manor cloaked in mystery. Don't forget to subscribe to stay on the trail with us. Vincent Gray, Sherlock Holmes, The Secret of the Broken Seal. The carriage wheels clattered over the cobbled road as Sherlock Holmes gazed out the window, the landscape blurring in the early morning fog. The air was thick, damp with the scent of wet earth and the distant smell of wood smoke. The manor loomed ahead, partially obscured by towering trees that seemed to whisper in the breeze. Holmes had been to countless places before, but there was something unsettling about the isolation of this one. The road, narrow and winding, offered no other way out, making it feel as though the entire world had been shut away, shut off. He adjusted his coat, his gloved hands resting on his lap, eyes narrowing in concentration. He was not one to be easily swayed by atmosphere, but there was something about this place that set his senses alight. The manor's silhouette against the grey sky seemed to hold secrets, the kind only a few would ever know. His mind raced with possibilities. This letter he had received, sealed with an emblem of a broken wax seal, a symbol he had come across many years ago, was his only clue. The sender's identity was vague, their words cryptic, but it was enough to pull him away from London's fog of familiarity and into this desolate corner of the country. The carriage finally came to a halt before the manor's imposing gates. The gates creaked open with a slow, drawn-out groan, as if protesting the arrival of anyone, let alone a detective of Holmes's stature. A manservant, tall and severe, stepped out from the shadows of the porch to greet him. His expression was unreadable, yet his movements suggested something more than mere courtesy, a strange, quiet anticipation. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" The butler's voice was low, but there was an undeniable sharpness to it. Holmes nodded, stepping out of the carriage with his usual grace, his gaze sweeping the grounds. "Indeed. I trust there is no need for pleasantries. I have received your letter." "Of course, sir." The man's lips pressed together in a thin line. "This way, please." Holmes followed the butler up the worn stone steps and into the manor. The door closed behind him with an eerie finality, as if sealing him into a different world altogether. Inside, the house was silent, save for the distant hum of a clock ticking away somewhere far off. The dim, yellowish light from the lanterns cast long shadows on the walls, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and dust. There was a feeling of stasis here. Nothing seemed to have changed for decades, not even the creak of the floorboards beneath his boots. The butler led him down a narrow hallway, stopping at the door to a small parlour. The room was cold, despite the fire that crackled faintly in the hearth. Holmes entered, his eyes immediately drawn to the collection of paintings that lined the walls, portraits of stern-looking men and women, their gazes fixed intently on whoever passed by. "They are all members of the Craymore family, sir," the butler offered, though Holmes had already deduced as much. Holmes gave a brief nod, his mind moving past the mundane details. "I trust the master of the house is expecting me?" The butler's eyes flickered, and there was an awkward hesitation before he responded. "Lord Craymore is in the study. He has been expecting you for some time." Holmes raised an eyebrow but said nothing. His eyes remained focused on the butler's face, noting the subtle shift in expression. It was fleeting but unmistakable, a touch of anxiety. "Very well," he said, his voice measured. "Lead the way." As they walked deeper into the house, the quiet was oppressive. The occasional sound of a distant footstep or the creaking of the house settling only made the silence more profound. Holmes couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. He could feel the tension in the air, thin threads of it weaving between the walls, as if the house itself were waiting for something. Or perhaps it was simply waiting for him. They arrived at the study door. The butler knocked gently, and after a moment, a voice from inside called, "Enter." Holmes stepped into the room, his sharp gaze immediately scanning the surroundings. Lord Craymore sat behind a large oak desk, his appearance fitting the image of a man of wealth. Tall, with thinning grey hair and a face marked by years of calculated decisions. His sharp eyes met Holmes's, sizing him up, but there was something unreadable in his expression. He motioned for Holmes to take a seat. "Mr. Holmes, I presume I am the subject of your visit." Lord Craymore's voice was deep and measured, each word carefully chosen. Holmes allowed a faint smile to tug at the corner of his lips, but there was little warmth behind it. "Indeed. Your letter intrigued me, Lord Craymore. A broken seal, a vague mystery. And yet, you make no mention of why I am here or the nature of the problem." Craymore's eyes flickered for a brief moment, but he quickly regained his composure. "I must admit, Mr. Holmes, the situation is delicate. It concerns a matter that goes beyond mere family affairs. Something far more sinister." Holmes leaned forward, steepling his fingers together, his sharp mind already calculating the possible angles. "Go on." Lord Craymore hesitated, then sighed heavily. "It involves an old manuscript, Mr. Holmes, one that has been in my family for generations. It is said to hold great power, and there are those who would stop at nothing to get their hands on it." Holmes studied the man carefully, his keen senses picking up on the subtle shift in his demeanour. "And you believe that someone intends to steal it?" Craymore's lips tightened, his expression darkening. "I fear that someone already has." The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting fleeting shadows on the walls of Lord Craymore's study. Holmes remained seated across from the Lord, his mind moving quickly through the possible implications of the words he had just heard. A stolen manuscript, a family heirloom of such value that it might inspire desperation in anyone who sought it. The intrigue of it was undeniable, yet Holmes sensed that Craymore was not revealing the full extent of his concerns. The man's posture was rigid, his fingers drumming lightly on the edge of the desk, betraying a subtle tension despite his otherwise composed appearance. Holmes noted the creases in his face, lines that seemed to have deepened with a long-standing weight of worry, though he carefully avoided meeting the detective's eyes for more than a second. "I must ask," Holmes began, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Why not contact the authorities, Lord Craymore? This matter seems too serious for secrecy." Craymore's eyes flickered, and he shifted in his seat, glancing toward the corner of the room as if to find some hidden strength there. "I did consider it, but—" He hesitated, his voice dropping. "This manuscript, Mr. Holmes, is not something that can be placed in the hands of the law. It is far too dangerous." Holmes regarded him closely, his gaze sharp. "Dangerous in what way?" Before Craymore could respond, the door to the study creaked open, interrupting the moment. A tall, slender woman entered, Lady Eleanor, his niece. She was dressed in a pale gown that matched the room's subdued hues, though the soft elegance of her attire did little to mask the wariness in her posture. Her gaze moved from Holmes to Craymore, her lips parting in a brief, measured greeting. "Mr. Holmes, I presume?" Her voice was soft, but held a firmness, as if she had already sized up the detective. She moved closer, standing beside her uncle's desk. There was a coolness to her demeanour, a distance that gave nothing away. Holmes rose politely, his gaze shifting to her. "Lady Eleanor, I assume?" She nodded, her expression unreadable. "Yes. I trust you'll be able to resolve this predicament." Her tone carried a subtle edge, and Holmes immediately picked up on it. There was something beneath her calm exterior, perhaps a suppressed anxiety, or perhaps a guarded disdain. She glanced at her uncle, then back to Holmes, her posture stiffening ever so slightly. "I understand," Holmes replied with a measured tone, maintaining eye contact. "Lord Craymore has briefed me on the nature of the problem. I'm afraid, however, I may need further details before I can form an opinion on the matter." Lady Eleanor's lips pressed together for a moment, her eyes narrowing just enough for Holmes to catch the flicker of unease. "It's a matter of family," she said, her voice lowering, "and of things best left in the past." Holmes watched her closely, the faintest hint of a smile crossing his lips. "Past or present, Lady Eleanor, the truth has a tendency of resurfacing when one least expects it." At this, her gaze hardened, but she said nothing more. Instead, she turned her attention back to her uncle, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, a slight tremor in her fingers barely perceptible. The tension in the room grew thicker, almost tangible. Holmes could feel the undercurrent of something unsaid, something hidden beneath the surface of this seemingly composed family. The air felt heavier, the flickering flames in the hearth casting long shadows across the walls, as though the room itself were holding its breath. Lord Craymore cleared his throat, but his gaze remained distant, his thoughts seemingly elsewhere. "I will leave you to your discussion," Lady Eleanor said abruptly, her voice cool, though Holmes caught the hesitation in her step as she made her way toward the door. She paused before exiting, glancing over her shoulder at Holmes. "If you need anything, Mr. Holmes, do not hesitate to ask. The staff here are more than willing to assist." Holmes nodded politely, his mind already turning over her words. The subtle discomfort in her tone was unmistakable. There was something she wasn't telling him, something she either feared or wished to keep hidden. He had learned long ago that people's outward calmness often masked their true emotions, and Lady Eleanor's carefully measured composure spoke volumes. As the door closed behind her, Holmes turned his attention back to Lord Craymore, who had remained silent during the exchange. He seemed to be deep in thought, his eyes focused on a point somewhere far beyond the study, lost in a labyrinth of his own making. Holmes studied the man for a long moment before speaking again. "Lady Eleanor appears concerned. Is there a deeper connection between her and the manuscript, Lord Craymore?" The old man stiffened at the question, and Holmes could almost see the walls go up around him. "My niece," Craymore began, his voice taut, "has always been protective of the family's legacy. She does not trust easily, and I fear her connection to this matter is far more complicated than she lets on." Holmes nodded thoughtfully, already forming the first of many connections in his mind. "Complicated indeed," he murmured, his voice almost to himself. The room had become colder since Lady Eleanor's departure. A strange sense of foreboding hung in the air, as if the walls themselves knew more than they were willing to reveal. Holmes could feel the weight of something approaching, something concealed in the shadows, waiting to be uncovered. He turned his gaze to Lord Craymore, whose stoic face revealed little, but whose hands trembled ever so slightly at the edges of the desk. "Lord Craymore," Holmes said, his tone now steady and deliberate, "I must ask you, is there anything else you have not told me? Any further details that might assist me in understanding the full scope of this situation?" Craymore's fingers paused mid-tremor before he slowly withdrew a piece of parchment from his desk drawer, unfolding it carefully in his hands. "This," he said, his voice low, "is what was taken." Holmes reached for the parchment, his fingers brushing against the fragile paper. As he scanned its contents, the intricacies of its symbols were not lost on him. The manuscript's significance was far more than simply historical. It was part of something larger, something dangerous. The plot was beginning to thicken, and Holmes could feel the pull of the mystery intensifying. He set the parchment down, his expression unreadable. "I will get to the bottom of this," he said, his words precise, his mind already racing ahead. The study was quiet save for the soft crackling of the fire, the warmth from the hearth not enough to dispel the chill that lingered in the corners of the room. Holmes sat in the same chair where he had been before, his fingers gently tapping against the armrest, the parchment in front of him now a symbol of an ever-expanding puzzle. The faint smell of must and leather hung in the air, mingling with the acrid scent of the firewood. His eyes traced the faint marks on the paper, each symbol seemingly meaningless. But there was something familiar about them, something that tugged at the corners of his memory. "Lord Craymore," Holmes said, his voice low but precise. "The manuscript you mentioned, what does it contain?" Craymore, still standing by the window, his back turned to the detective, did not answer immediately. Instead, he stared out at the estate grounds, his face drawn and distant. The storm clouds were beginning to gather overhead, and the manor, with its towering spires, looked more ominous than ever. There was a tension in the air, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "It is said to contain knowledge." Craymore's voice broke the silence, his tone heavy with something more than simple fear. "Knowledge of an ancient order, a secret society that has operated for centuries. The manuscript holds their teachings, their history, and I suspect, their power." Holmes's brow furrowed. "A secret society? And you believe someone here is after this knowledge?" Craymore finally turned to face him, his eyes wide, dark circles beneath them. He looked years older than when they had first met, as though the weight of his words had drained the life from him. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. I do not think they are interested in the manuscript alone. I fear they are after much more." Holmes's mind raced. There were too many questions, too many unknowns. The missing manuscript, the cryptic symbols, the shadowy figures that now seemed to lurk in every corner of the manor. Each piece was a link in a chain that bound them all together. But where did it lead? To what end? "Do you suspect anyone in particular?" Holmes asked, his voice unwavering, though there was an edge to his words. His eyes searched Craymore's face for any sign of truth, any crack in the facade that would reveal more than what had been said. Craymore hesitated, his fingers gripping the edge of the desk as though he was bracing himself. "I do not know, but I believe my niece, Lady Eleanor. She's been acting strange lately, Mr. Holmes, as if she is hiding something." Holmes's sharp gaze followed Craymore's every movement, noting the man's growing unease. The tension in the room had shifted, now focused entirely on the elderly lord and his revelation. Holmes's instincts sharpened, pulling him closer to the truth. If Lady Eleanor had something to hide, then she was perhaps the key to unlocking the mystery of the manuscript's disappearance. A sudden noise broke the moment, loud, unexpected, and out of place in the quiet of the study. A scream. The sound came from somewhere deep within the house, distant but unmistakable, filled with terror. It was a woman's scream, sharp and guttural, echoing through the manor's thick stone walls. Holmes's body tensed, his hand immediately reaching for his coat, as though the air had grown colder, more urgent. Without a word, he moved toward the door, Craymore stumbling behind him, his face pale. The hallway was a labyrinth of dark corners and heavy wooden doors, each turn leading them deeper into the heart of the house. The scream had died down, leaving only the heavy silence that hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Holmes's mind raced as they hurried down the corridor. He could feel the weight of each passing second, the growing sense of something unfolding just beyond his reach. They reached the staircase, and the source of the scream became evident. A maid, young and trembling, stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with terror. She pointed a shaky hand toward a door at the far end of the hallway. "Lord Craymore," she stammered, It's him. It's your uncle. He's dead." The words hung in the air, cold and final, like a death sentence delivered in the silence of the manor. Holmes's heart quickened, and for the first time since his arrival, he felt the undeniable weight of danger that had been lurking in the shadows. Craymore's face drained of colour, his voice barely above a whisper. What do you mean?" The maid choked back a sob, her body trembling. "It's Lord Craymore, your brother, sir. He's in the study, dead, the same way as your uncle." Holmes's gaze flicked to Craymore, whose face had gone ashen. His legs seemed to falter beneath him, and he gripped the banister for support. "Stay here," Holmes ordered the maid, his voice firm and commanding. "Do not let anyone enter." Holmes moved swiftly, pushing past Craymore and taking the stairs 2 at a time. The study door was already ajar when he arrived, and the sight that greeted him sent a chill running down his spine. Lord Craymore lay slumped over his desk, the very same position in which they had left him just moments ago. But now, his life had been snuffed out. His eyes were wide open in an expression of shock, his hand still clutching the very same manuscript that had started this entire chain of events. There was no blood, no obvious signs of violence, nothing that would explain how a man could die so suddenly. And yet, his death was unmistakable. Holmes bent down to examine the body, his sharp eyes scanning every inch of the room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, its warmth doing nothing to relieve the coldness that had taken over the space. He noticed the faint scent of something unfamiliar in the air, an herb, perhaps, or a chemical, though it was too faint to place. His mind raced as he catalogued every detail, every shift in the scene. There was no obvious sign of a struggle, no indication of how Lord Craymore had met his end. But Holmes could sense it, the same sense of something hidden, something just out of view, that had drawn him to the manor in the first place. The manuscript, still in Craymore's hand, seemed to hold the key to this mystery. But the question was, what had it cost him to keep it? Holmes straightened up, his gaze now fixed on the body of the elderly man, a silent resolve settling over him. A most curious case indeed, he muttered to himself. Holmes stood in the study, his eyes trained on Lord Craymore's lifeless body. The old man's hand still clutched the manuscript, his fingers stiff with death, as though he had been unwilling or unable to let go of the object that had ultimately claimed his life. The faint scent of burning wood mixed with something more acrid in the air, though Holmes could not place it. His senses were sharp, but the room seemed to hold an atmosphere of eerie silence, as if the manor itself were pressing in on him, unwilling to yield its secrets. Holmes took a few steps toward the desk, kneeling beside Lord Craymore's body. He carefully extracted the manuscript from the man's hand, turning it over to study its worn cover. It had the look of something very old, the binding cracked and the edges frayed. There were no visible markings, no identifying symbols, just the familiar weight of something that had been passed down through generations, an object of mystery. He slipped it into his coat, his fingers lingering on its surface for just a moment longer than necessary. "Do not touch anything," Holmes instructed firmly without looking up, his voice a steady presence amidst the tension. He could feel Craymore's eyes on him, the elderly man's shock still fresh in his mind. Craymore, now standing in the doorway, nodded slowly but did not speak. His expression was blank, his shoulders slumped as though the weight of his brother's death had already begun to crush him. Holmes had seen it before, grief that rendered a person numb, detached from everything around them. And yet, there was something in Craymore's eyes that spoke of more than just sorrow. His gaze flitted to the body, then away, as though it pained him to look. Holmes stood and turned toward the rest of the room. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting faint shadows that danced across the floor. The air smelled faintly of burnt wood and the mustiness of old books, but there was something about it now that seemed different, charged, like the atmosphere just before a storm. "Lord Craymore," Holmes began, his voice calm but insistent. "I need to know more about the manuscript. It seems that whatever is hidden within it, it's the key to this death." Craymore took a hesitant step forward, his expression unreadable. "It is just a book, Mr. Holmes. A family heirloom passed down through generations. Nothing of importance, nothing that could cause such an event." Holmes gave him a measured look, unconvinced. He moved toward the study door, his keen eyes scanning the room as he did. Everything appeared to be in its place, but the tension in the room told him that appearances were deceiving. Something was amiss. He approached the desk, carefully examining the surrounding area. "What's this?" he murmured, his eyes narrowing as he spotted a small object beneath the edge of the desk. Bending down, he retrieved it, his fingers brushing against the cold metal. It was a small vial, its contents dark and viscous, almost like oil, but with a slightly rancid scent. Craymore flinched, his face suddenly pale. That That is nothing, Mr. Holmes. Just a harmless oil for the clock in the corner. Holmes stood up slowly, holding the vial in his hand. This does not appear to be a harmless oil. It is more than likely that this, or something like it, was used to ensure Lord Cramore's swift departure from this world. The question is, how and why? Cramore's hands trembled slightly, and he turned away, his eyes darting toward the far corner of the room as if trying to avoid the question. Holmes did not press further for the moment. Instead, he moved toward the window, pushing aside the heavy curtains to peer out into the now darkened estate grounds. The rain had begun to fall steadily, the drops splattering against the window pane, adding to the oppressive weight in the air. Was Lord Cramore the only one in the study before the incident? Holmes asked, his gaze still fixed outside. Cramore shook his head, his voice barely audible. Number Lady Eleanor was with him earlier. They were discussing family matters. She left before I arrived. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Lady Eleanor. Her name had surfaced again, and with it, a sense of unease. He turned back toward Cramore, who was now standing by the door, his face a mask of exhaustion. Has anything unusual occurred recently? Holmes pressed, his voice sharp with intent. Anything out of the ordinary? Any strange behaviour? Cramore's eyes flicked downward, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. Lady Eleanor. She has been acting strange for weeks. I don't know what it is, but she has been distant. Closed off. Holmes leaned forward, his eyes piercing through Cramore. Distant in what way? Cramore hesitated, then exhaled sharply. She has been obsessed with something. With the manuscript, perhaps. She's kept to herself more often than not. I don't know what she's looking for, but I fear it is something dangerous. Holmes stood still for a moment, his thoughts swirling. A connection between the manuscript, Lady Eleanor's strange behaviour, and now Lord Cramore's sudden death seemed to be forming before his very eyes. He glanced toward the desk again, his mind racing. There was more to this. Of that he was certain. Then it seems, Holmes said slowly, his voice taking on an almost thoughtful tone, that we are not just dealing with a stolen manuscript, but something far more insidious, a hidden agenda, and Lady Eleanor may hold the key to unlocking it. Before Cramore could respond, Holmes turned toward the door, motioning for him to follow. Come, Lord Cramore, there is still much to uncover. They stepped into the dimly lit hallway, the heavy silence pressing around them. The footsteps echoed off the stone walls as they made their way toward Lady Eleanor's quarters. Holmes's mind was already moving, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to form, though much remained hidden in the shadows. Holmes stood at the threshold of Lady Eleanor's quarters, the faint creak of the floorboards beneath his feet, the only sound in the stillness of the house. The hallway had grown colder, the rain outside tapping softly against the windows, adding an eerie rhythm to the otherwise oppressive silence. The air felt thick, suffused with an invisible tension that seemed to curl around the walls of the manor like a thick fog. Holmes had seen this before, when the truth was near, but hidden just out of reach, when every small detail felt as if it could either break the case wide open or send it spiraling into confusion. He knocked twice, his gloved hand leaving a brief impression on the wood. A moment passed before the door creaked open, revealing Lady Eleanor standing in the doorway. Her expression was a mask of composed indifference, though her eyes betrayed a hint of strain, the faintest shadows of worry behind her measured calm. The soft flicker of candlelight from within the room framed her figure, casting her in an almost ghostly glow, adding to the air of mystery that seemed to surround her. Mr. Holmes, she said with a polite nod, her voice as cool and composed as ever. I assume you have come to speak with me? Holmes surveyed her carefully, noting the subtle tension in her posture. Her movements were too controlled, too deliberate, as if she were constantly aware of every gesture, every look. Lady Eleanor, he replied, his tone polite but carrying an underlying sharpness. I do apologize for disturbing you at this hour, but I believe we must talk. She stepped back from the doorway to allow him entry, and Holmes followed, taking in the room as he did. The space was modest, but tastefully furnished, with dark mahogany furniture and drapes that were drawn tight against the dim evening light. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, masking the faint smell of something else, something not quite so pleasant. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the room as he took a seat by the fire, his movements fluid, deliberate. He could sense her wariness, her reluctance, but it only fueled his curiosity further. "Please, make yourself comfortable," Lady Eleanor offered, though her voice held none of the warmth the words would typically suggest. She stood across from him, her hands clasped tightly before her, as though her body could not quite settle. "I would rather get straight to the point," Holmes replied, his eyes never leaving her face. "Lord Craymore has informed me of some troubling behaviour on your part, Lady Eleanor. I must ask you, what is it you have been seeking, and why have you been so preoccupied with the manuscript?" The room seemed to grow quieter as he spoke, the crackling of the fire now an almost deafening backdrop to the tension that thickened the air. Lady Eleanor's gaze flickered for a brief moment, her eyes narrowed, lips pressed into a thin line. Her composure was slipping, but only slightly. It was enough for Holmes to know he had struck a nerve. "I do not know what you mean, Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice now a touch tighter than before. "I have had no particular interest in the manuscript beyond what has been necessary to preserve my family's legacy." Holmes studied her carefully, his mind already working to unravel the layers of her carefully constructed facade. He leaned forward slightly, his tone soft but deliberate. "Yet, it seems that you have been acting quite differently. The maid, she informed me of a number of peculiar occurrences, strange behaviours, obsessive thoughts. Are you truly suggesting that these are merely figments of her imagination?" Lady Eleanor's eyes narrowed further, her jaw tightening. For a moment, the veneer of composure cracked, and Holmes could see the edge of something darker beneath her calm surface. "The maid. She has an overactive imagination. You are simply jumping to conclusions." Holmes's lips quirked slightly, though there was no warmth in the smile. "Am I? Perhaps. Or perhaps, Lady Eleanor, you are merely trying to deflect attention from something more pressing. Your uncle's death, for example." At the mention of her uncle, Lady Eleanor stiffened, the temperature in the room seeming to drop a few degrees. Her face remained impassive, but the way her hands clenched at her sides spoke volumes. She was on the defensive now, her calm facade cracking under the pressure. "I have no idea what you mean," she said, her voice even but strained. "My uncle's death. It is a tragedy, but I fail to see how I could have any involvement in it." Holmes's gaze softened only slightly, but his next words were incisive. "And yet, you were the last to see him alive, were you not? Before he passed." Lady Eleanor's breath caught, her eyes darting toward the floor for a brief moment before she regained control, her head snapping up to meet his gaze. "I don't understand what you are implying," she said, her voice trembling ever so slightly, though she quickly masked it with a forced calmness. "I was simply with him, discussing family matters. That's all." Holmes considered this for a moment, his sharp mind processing the information. There was a lie in her words, a subtle shift in her demeanour. Something about the way she spoke, the way her voice wavered just slightly when she mentioned the conversation, suggested that her account was incomplete, or perhaps even intentionally misleading. He stood up slowly, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. "Lady Eleanor," he said softly, his voice carrying an unspoken weight. "There is more to this than you are telling me. And until you are ready to speak the truth, I must ask that you remain available for further questions. There are too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions." And Lady Eleanor's eyes flashed with something that could have been anger, or perhaps fear. Holmes wasn't sure, but there was no mistaking the flicker of something else that passed behind her carefully composed eyes. It was a momentary crack in her armour, a brief glimpse of vulnerability that did not go unnoticed. "Mr. Holmes," she said finally, her voice colder now. "I have nothing more to say. I have been nothing but honest with you. If you believe I am involved in this tragedy, then you are gravely mistaken." Holmes gave a small nod, his expression unreadable. "We shall see, Lady Eleanor. We shall see." As he turned to leave, he could sense her eyes on him, though she said nothing further. The door clicked shut softly behind him, and he stood for a moment in the hallway, allowing the silence to settle around him. The house seemed even quieter now, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something, or someone, to reveal the truth. The silence of the manor had grown unbearable, each room heavy with the unspoken tension that gripped it. Holmes's mind buzzed with questions, the pieces of the puzzle not yet fitting together. He had spoken with Lady Eleanor, and while her words were carefully chosen, they revealed little more than the careful evasion he had expected. The manor, with its dark corners and muffled whispers, held secrets beneath its stoic exterior, and Holmes was determined to uncover them. He moved swiftly through the house, his sharp eyes scanning every detail, every item that could hold the smallest clue. The heavy scent of old wood and candle wax lingered in the air, mixing with the mustiness of the manor's many years of secrets. Holmes paused for a moment, his gaze lingering on the portrait of a man that hung on the wall just outside the study. The face was familiar, Lord Craymore, in a younger, happier time, but there was something unsettling about it. The man's eyes, frozen in time, seemed to follow him. It was a moment of distraction, but not for long. Holmes's thoughts quickly returned to the matter at hand. The contradictions in Lady Eleanor's story were undeniable, and the timing of Lord Craymore's death seemed too precise to be purely coincidental. She had been the last to see him alive, and yet her statements were at odds with the scene in the study. There was a hidden truth in her behaviour, something she was not willing to reveal. As Holmes continued down the hallway, his mind worked through the inconsistencies. Lady Eleanor had claimed to be discussing family matters with her uncle, but that didn't explain the strained atmosphere he had felt during their conversation. Her eyes had darted toward the floor when she mentioned the subject of the conversation, and her voice had betrayed a faint tremor. It was subtle, but it was enough to raise Holmes's suspicions. He passed the maid's quarters, where he had heard the frantic whispers just a few hours earlier. The maid, too, had seen something, a nervous glance here, a strange behaviour there, and though her details had been fragmentary, they provided just enough information to start weaving a clearer picture. The maid had mentioned hearing raised voices, though she had not been able to make out the words. It was nothing conclusive, but it was yet another piece to add to the puzzle. Holmes's thoughts were interrupted as he reached the study door once again. The rain had intensified outside, the sound of it tapping against the windows a constant reminder of the world beyond the walls. The air inside was colder now, a subtle shift in temperature that spoke of the manor's unwillingness to let go of its secrets. Holmes opened the door and stepped inside. The study was untouched, save for the presence of Lord Craymore's body, which had been removed earlier. The fire in the hearth crackled softly, its glow casting faint shadows across the room. Holmes's eyes immediately went to the desk, where the manuscript lay earlier, but it was gone. The subtle shift in the room, the absence of something so crucial, did not go unnoticed. He moved to the desk, his fingers lightly brushing the surface. The faint scent of the same oil that had been found near Craymore's body lingered in the air, but now it was stronger, as if it had been deliberately applied to the desk, perhaps to mask something else. The vial, the one he had discovered earlier, had been taken. It was gone, leaving only the faintest trace of its presence. Holmes frowned, his thoughts spinning. Had the vial been the cause of Lord Craymore's death, or had it been something else entirely? A sudden creak of the floorboards behind him caused Holmes to turn sharply, his instincts honed and ready. The butler, Mr. Finch, had entered the room, his expression neutral, though his posture was stiffer than usual. His eyes darted toward the desk, then quickly moved back to Holmes. "Mr. Holmes," Finch began, his voice steady but guarded, "I trust you've finished your investigation in here?" Holmes didn't answer immediately, his eyes narrowing as he considered the butler's presence. Finch had been a quiet observer during the investigation, his demeanour almost too perfect. There was no hint of emotion in his voice, no change in his expression, but Holmes could sense the subtle tension in his posture. Finch was holding something back. "I have yet to finish, Mr. Finch," Holmes replied, his tone deliberate. "I believe there is more to discover." Finch gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Of course, Mr. Holmes. If there is anything I can assist you with—" "Actually," Holmes interrupted, his gaze locking onto Finch's face, "I would appreciate it if you could tell me more about the circumstances leading up to Lord Cramore's death. You were, after all, one of the few people who had access to the study in the hours before it happened." Finch hesitated for a brief moment, his lips pressing together tightly, as though weighing his words. I don't know what you mean, Mr. Holmes. I was not in the study during the time of Lord Cramore's death." "But you were there," Holmes cut in, his voice sharp. "You've been with the family for years, Mr. Finch. You know the inner workings of this household better than anyone else. There are inconsistencies in your story. The maid mentioned seeing you leave the study shortly before the incident occurred." Finch's eyes flickered, just for a moment, but it was enough for Holmes to notice. His hand clenched into a fist at his side, his jaw tightening. For a fleeting moment, the perfect mask slipped. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes," Finch said, his voice now more strained, "I have nothing to hide." Holmes's gaze remained fixed on him, his mind working quickly to piece together the small cracks that were beginning to form. Finch had been too calm, too controlled in his demeanour. There was more to this, something Finch wasn't revealing. "Perhaps you should consider what it is you are withholding," Holmes murmured, his eyes narrowing. "The truth, Mr. Finch, has a way of coming to light in the most unexpected places." Finch said nothing, but his face grew paler. The tension in the room thickened as the butler stepped back, his movements stiff and deliberate. Holmes could almost see the calculation behind his eyes, as though Finch was already considering his next move. Holmes turned away, his mind racing with possibilities. It was clear that the butler was involved in some way, but what was his role in all of this? Had he acted alone, or was he simply a pawn in a larger game? Holmes knew that the truth was still eluding him, but the pieces were slowly starting to fall into place. As Finch left the room, Holmes's thoughts returned to Lady Eleanor. Her behaviour, her reluctance to speak, her evasions, they all pointed towards something far darker. The manuscript, the vial, the contradictions in the stories, they were all part of the same web. Holmes was closer to uncovering the truth, but he knew that the final pieces were yet to be revealed. Holmes's steps echoed through the narrow hallway as he paced back and forth, the dim light from the sconces casting shadows along the walls. The rain outside continued its relentless tapping against the windows, a constant reminder of the pressure that seemed to be mounting in the manor. His mind was a flurry of calculations and deductions, each thought building upon the last, though the picture was still not clear. The various pieces of the puzzle were scattered about him. Lady Eleanor's suspicious behaviour, Finch's nervous glances, the missing manuscript, and now the vial that had been found in the study. It was all connected. But how? Holmes stopped, his gaze drifting over the dark wood of the hallway's furniture, the fading portraits that lined the walls. His sharp mind sifted through the facts, the lies, and the half-truths, looking for that one decisive thread to tie them all together. It had to be there, some overlooked detail that would expose the truth. The knock at the door startled him, the brief interruption pulling him from his thoughts. He turned quickly, the sharpness in his gaze softening only when he recognized the visitor. "Ah, Lord Cramore," Holmes greeted, his voice steady but carrying an edge of impatience. "I was just reflecting on the case." Cramore entered the room, his face pale, eyes drawn and weary. The weight of his brother's death seemed to hang around him like a cloak, and his movements were slow, almost mechanical, as though he were a man struggling to hold himself together. Holmes stepped aside, motioning for him to sit. Please, have a seat, Holmes said, his voice neutral. We need to discuss your brother's death further. I believe we are nearing the truth. Craymore lowered himself into the chair, his hands trembling slightly as he folded them in his lap. I don't know how much more I can bear, Mr. Holmes, he confessed, his voice raw. This whole affair, it feels like a nightmare. My brother, and now Eleanor. Holmes regarded him closely, his eyes narrowing. Lady Eleanor, yes. There seems to be a great deal of mystery surrounding her actions, and I fear her involvement may be more significant than we first assumed. Craymore's face stiffened, his eyes flicking to the floor as if the weight of the accusation were too heavy to bear. I never wanted to believe it, Mr. Holmes. Eleanor is my niece, and she has always been distant, yes, but I never thought she could be involved in something like this. Holmes took a step closer, his tone turning more insistent. Tell me, Lord Craymore, what exactly has been happening with Lady Eleanor? You mentioned her strange behaviour. Was there anything unusual that might give us insight into her motives? Craymore hesitated, his fingers twitching as though the words were caught somewhere deep within him. Finally he spoke, his voice quiet, as if afraid of the implications. I don't know for sure, but I suspect she's been keeping something from me. Something she's hiding. She's been obsessed with the manuscript for weeks, perhaps even longer. But it wasn't until recently that I saw just how far her obsession had gone. She began asking questions about the family, about things I thought were long buried. Holmes listened intently, his mind working rapidly to form a connection. The manuscript, Eleanor's obsession, and then the vial. Everything seemed to lead back to one central point, though Holmes knew it would take more than mere suspicion to form a solid theory. Did she ever mention anyone else? Holmes asked, his gaze piercing. Has she confided in anyone about what she's been looking for? Did she ever mention her motives? Craymore shook his head, his face drawn. But she's been visiting the library more frequently, poring over old records and books. She even asked me about the family's history, about things that we had never spoken of. She seemed desperate. Holmes's eyes flickered toward the door, as if the room itself held the answers he was seeking. Desperation, he murmured, almost to himself. It is the fuel for many actions, particularly when one seeks something forbidden. He paused, considering the various threads of the investigation, Lady Eleanor's strange behaviour, the manuscript's significance, the vial, the contradictions in Finch's story. The key was in the connections, he realised, and the pieces were slowly beginning to form a clearer picture. A theory began to take shape in his mind, one that was both simple and unsettling. Lord Craymore, Holmes said, turning back to face him with a look of quiet determination. I believe the answer lies in the manuscript itself. There is something more to it, something beyond mere family history. It's not just a book, it's a key, and Lady Eleanor is not the only one who has been seeking it. Craymore looked up, his expression confused, but Holmes could see the flicker of recognition in his eyes. The air in the room seemed to grow heavier, charged with a sudden awareness. Holmes stepped toward the desk, his fingers brushing against the smooth surface. Lady Eleanor may have been after the manuscript for her own reasons, but I suspect someone else may have had a more personal interest in it. The vial, the one found in the study, it was not just a random object. It was used to incapacitate Lord Craymore, and the person who had access to it. He turned sharply, his gaze locking onto Craymore's. That person, Lord Craymore, is likely standing before me. Craymore's face went pale, his hands trembling as the realization hit him. You think that I... His voice trailed off, and he seemed to shrink in on himself. Holmes nodded, his voice calm but heavy with implication. I believe you were the one who sought to claim the manuscript for yourself, Lord Craymore. It was you who orchestrated your brother's death, hoping to gain control of the family's hidden power. But you underestimated the forces at play, and the people who would go to great lengths to protect what's been kept secret for generations. The atmosphere in the room was taut, the silence hanging thick and heavy between Holmes and Lord Craymore. Outside, the storm raged on, its fury matching the tension that now filled the manor. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting fleeting shadows across the room. But to Holmes, the room had grown cold, as though the very walls themselves were closing in. The truth, so close yet so elusive, had finally come into view, and now it demanded to be faced. Holmes's eyes remained fixed on Lord Craymore, his mind processing the man's reaction. The old lord had gone ashen, his hands trembling at his sides. For the first time since Holmes had entered the manor, Craymore seemed genuinely afraid, his composure slipping like sand through his fingers. "You—" Craymore's voice faltered, and he swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for an escape, though there was none. "You can't possibly believe I do, Lord Craymore," Holmes said firmly, his voice steady, cutting through the air with unyielding certainty. "You murdered your brother. You killed him to take control of the manuscript. You hoped that in his absence, you could harness the power that was locked within its pages." Craymore recoiled, as though struck by the accusation. His face twisted in horror, his lips parted in a silent plea. But no words came. The truth had been laid bare, and he could no longer deny it. Holmes could see the deep conflict in his eyes, the terror of being exposed, the fear of what might come next. "You," Craymore began, his voice barely a whisper, "you have no idea what you're talking about." "Oh, but I do." Holmes's tone was unshaken, his every word deliberate. He took a step closer to Craymore, his eyes narrowing, his presence imposing. "I know the manuscript's history. I know the stories it contains. It holds not just the history of your family, but the key to a much larger secret, a secret that could grant untold power to whoever controls it. That power was your obsession, Lord Craymore. It drove you to murder, to betray your own flesh and blood." Craymore trembled, his hands clutching the arms of his chair as if trying to hold himself together. He opened his mouth, but no words emerged at first. Then, slowly, almost reluctantly, he spoke. "I did what I had to do," he confessed, his voice shaking now, raw with desperation. "You don't understand. My brother was weak. He couldn't see what was right in front of him. The manuscript, it's the key to everything. The power it holds could make me stronger than anyone ever imagined. And I needed it." Holmes's gaze softened, though his resolve did not waver. "You believed that by taking the manuscript you could control it," he said quietly, his voice almost sad. "But power like that, power over secrets and lives, never belongs to one man. It corrupts Lord Craymore. It destroys those who seek to wield it." The old lord looked away, his eyes clouded with a mixture of regret and defiance. His breathing had quickened, his chest rising and falling with each laboured inhale. I was so close to uncovering everything." Holmes's mind raced as he pieced the final details together. The manuscript, the vial found in the study, the strange behaviour of Lady Eleanor, Finch's guarded responses, they were all part of the same dark narrative. And now, the truth was unmistakable. Craymore's greed had led him to kill, and in his desperation, he had ignored the warning signs of the ruin he was about to bring upon himself. "Did you truly think you could control it all?" Holmes asked, his voice steady, though there was a faint edge of pity in his words. "You murdered your brother, and for what? A piece of history? A relic of power?" Craymore's gaze darted toward the desk where the manuscript had once rested, the empty space now a symbol of his failure. His lips trembled as he spoke again, this time with a deeper, almost mournful tone. I thought I could be the one to finish what my ancestors started, to find the truth, to have the strength to... To what end?" Holmes interrupted, his patience running thin. "The truth is not meant to be controlled, Lord Craymore. It is meant to be discovered, and sometimes it is a truth better left undisturbed." Craymore slumped in his chair, his eyes closing as though the weight of his actions were finally catching up to him. His shoulders heaved with a long, shuddering breath. The tears that welled in his eyes were not of remorse, but of realization, of the final, terrible understanding that the power he sought would never have been his, no matter how hard he tried to seize it. Holmes stood silent for a moment, watching the man crumble beneath the weight of his own guilt. He had seen it before, the inevitable collapse of those who sought power without understanding the cost. It was always the same, the thirst for control, the belief that the truth could be bent to their will, and ultimately, the destruction that followed. Then, as the storm outside intensified, Holmes spoke once more, his voice low but firm. "It's over, Lord Craymore. You will have to answer for what you've done. Your pursuit of power has cost you everything." The room seemed to grow colder as Holmes turned toward the door. He paused for a moment, casting one last glance at the broken man behind him. "I suggest you make peace with what remains of your conscience," he added quietly, "for it will be the only thing left to you." With that, Holmes left the room, stepping into the cold, rain-soaked hallway. The manor, once so full of secrets, now seemed to echo with silence. The case was over, but Holmes knew that the truth, once revealed, would linger in the air like smoke. The rain had stopped by the time Holmes left the manor, though the clouds remained heavy, hanging low in the sky like a dark, unbroken curtain. The manor, still shrouded in mist, seemed even more oppressive in the aftermath of the confession. The silence that enveloped it was now unshakable, the weight of guilt and revelation settling into every corner of the old house. Holmes's mind, though, was already moving away from the present, away from the confining walls of the manor, toward the broader picture, the final threads of the case. He paused for a moment on the porch, the cool air biting at his skin as he looked back at the dark silhouette of the house. It had been a long journey to this point, the tension, the mysteries, the characters all woven together by the fragile string of truth. Each had played their part. But now that it was over, Holmes could not help but feel a subtle ache of disappointment. He had uncovered the truth, yet there was no satisfaction in the unravelling of Craymore's broken ambition. The gravel beneath his feet crunched softly as he turned away from the manor, his footsteps steady and purposeful, though his thoughts lingered on the last exchange with Lord Craymore. The man had collapsed under the weight of his guilt, as Holmes had anticipated. But beneath that remorse was something far more troubling, the realization that Craymore had been motivated not by malice alone, but by a desire to control, to dominate the very forces he could never hope to understand. His ambition had consumed him, and in the end, it had led him to destroy everything he held dear. Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the grounds, the sprawling estate now looking more like a prison than a home. The few servants who had remained to tidy up the manor moved in the distance, their faces shadowed with the lingering uncertainty of the last few days. The household had been irreparably shaken by the events that had transpired, and Holmes could see that the quiet unravelling of their lives would continue long after he left. Craymore would face justice, of course. No doubt he would be taken into custody soon. Yet, for all his crimes, the true extent of his actions had never been truly understood. It wasn't just the murder of his brother, or the theft of the manuscript. It was the entire web of deceit, manipulation, and twisted ambition that had driven him to destroy his own family. His obsession with the power contained within that ancient manuscript had been his undoing. Holmes walked toward the carriage that waited for him by the gates, its horses stamping impatiently in the mud. The driver, standing by the reins, nodded respectfully, but said nothing as Holmes climbed in, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. The sound of the wheels on gravel was a gentle reminder of how far he had come, from the hushed, stifling air of the manor to the open road that now lay ahead. The heavy clouds finally parted as the carriage began its journey away from the estate, the light from the setting sun piercing through the clouds in a pale, diffused glow. Inside the carriage, Holmes leaned back, his gaze resting on the window, watching as the landscape passed by. He thought of Lady Eleanor, of the secrets she had kept, and of the part she had played in her uncle's downfall. Her involvement had been far more subtle than Cramore's, but no less significant. Her fixation with the manuscript, her distant manner, and her reluctance to speak, Holmes had seen enough to understand that she was driven by something deeper than mere family loyalty. Yet in the end, she had not been the murderer. She had simply been another piece in a much larger puzzle, one that had ultimately led to Cramore's tragic demise. As the carriage picked up speed, Holmes's mind shifted toward the aftermath of the case, the resolution of the mystery, the finality of the truth. It was a rare thing, this feeling of closure. In most cases, the truth was elusive, a shifting shadow that could never quite be caught. But in this instance, the truth had been tangible, undeniable. Cramore had been exposed for what he truly was, an ambitious man whose hunger for power had led him to betray everything he once held dear. The clattering of the wheels against the road faded as Holmes's thoughts began to settle. The case was over. The criminal had been apprehended. Yet, as always, there was no real satisfaction in the resolution. Holmes had solved the puzzle, but the answer left him with a lingering sense of something incomplete. His mind drifted back to the manuscript, to the power it contained. The world was full of secrets like this, hidden forces, buried knowledge, and the men and women who would stop at nothing to unearth it. Some of them would use that knowledge for good, others for their own selfish gain. But in the end, the pursuit of such power always came with a cost. Holmes turned his gaze back to the horizon, the fleeting light of dusk casting long shadows across the land. He could not shake the feeling that, despite the case being resolved, there were still questions left unanswered. What would become of the manuscript? What other secrets were hidden within its pages, and who would come after it next? These questions lingered in his mind, like pieces of a larger puzzle still waiting to be solved. As the carriage continued its journey through the fading light, Holmes closed his eyes for a moment, his mind already turning to the next mystery that awaited him. There would always be another case, another riddle to solve, another truth to uncover. But for now, he could rest easy knowing that this particular mystery had been brought to its inevitable conclusion. The manor, the storm, and the tangled web of lies that had once seemed so impenetrable were now behind him, but the shadow of it would remain. After all, a detective's work was never truly finished, not when there were still so many secrets left to uncover.